Hello, I'm Amy Walter, filling in for Gwen Ifill this week. Welcome to the Washington Week Webcast Extra. I'm joined around the table by Indira Lakshamanan of Bloomberg News, Susan Davis of USA Today, and Ed O'Keefe of The Washington Post. All right, Sue, let's start where we ended,
okay.
Which we gave this tease about somebody running for the United States Senate named Scott Brown, not running, though, in his home state of Massachusetts, or at least where he represented the last 4 years. But he's actually moving to New Hampshire.
Moved to New Hampshire.
One
of the newest residents of New Hampshire.
And what did he say this afternoon?
Well, he also ended sort of probably the biggest tease of 2014. Scott Brown has been talking and teasing, and he's in and he's out, and he might not. And finally on Friday, he announced he's an exploratory bid for the Senate, which is all but certain to lead to a bid to take on Democrat Jeanne Shaheen. He is, as far as Republicans are considered, a top recruit. He's got almost universal name ID in a state that shared a media market with Boston. He's a well-known national name from winning the Ted Kennedy seat. You know, he's a celebrity in his own right. He's going to be able to raise a ton of money, and he is, as today in his speech, he really emphasized his New Hampshire roots. He vacationed there as a child. His parents used to live there, and I don't know if that's going to work on Granite State voters, but I think he's got a long time to establish himself. And when you look at poll numbers, he's polling pretty competitively, not close enough that you could see this becoming a race right now. And Republicans feel that New Hampshire is one of these states where they can expand the map. They are on offense almost in every race this cycle. So putting another race on the board puts them in a very good position to gain those 6 seats they need for a takeover.
Isn't Senator Shaheen just going to take him to task for being the worst kind of carpetbagger?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? So carpetbagger is such an established attack in politics, but New Hampshire itself is a bit of a transient state. A lot of people that live there aren't from there, but a lot of people retire there. A lot of people from Massachusetts move there. Scott Brown's brand of republicanism plays well in New Hampshire. It's the kind of sort of independent-leaning conservatism that they like there.
Pickup truck driving.
Yeah, you know, he has his brand of authenticity, if that can be a brand. So it's going to be one of the more fun races to watch. I think we'll know pretty quickly with both money and poll numbers if this is going to be a serious race. But any place where Republicans force Democrats to expend more energy and spend more money is a win for them without a doubt.
And that's the bigger issue here, is that Republicans now are successfully expanding the map. A few weeks ago, they got a very popular Congressman, Cory Gardner, in Colorado, running against Mark Udall. Now we got Scott Brown in New Hampshire.
Michigan is also proving to be a surprising battleground for Republicans. And when you look at it in the opposite, where Democrats, they're not the only place that Democrats are on offense, is in the South, which is one of the most hostile areas for the Democratic Party. So when you just look at the map, it's just things are just really falling into place for Republicans. But don't ever underestimate their ability to screw it up, as they have in the past 2 cycles. So we'll see.
So
how
we will wait and see.
We'll see how
after the primaries.
But right
we will
now,
find out.
The stars are aligning in a good place for them.
All right, Indira, let's go back and talk to you for a moment here about Ukraine. You know, we've done a lot of psychoanalysis about the relationship between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, but we haven't heard much about Secretary of State Kerry and Sergei Lavrov, who's his counterpart on the Russian side. They spent 6 hours together. They've obviously in London the other day or today. What is their relationship like, and what do we know about how these two interact with each other?
These two have had what those of us who cover Secretary Kerry have called a bromance, basically going for the last year plus. You know, they really came together on a number of issues, from Syria, you know, solving so-called the chemical weapons crisis, Iran, finally a deal came together on Iran, and they've been very buddy-buddy. We've been at previous press conferences with John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov where they were, you know, nudging each other, winking and joking about, you know, a number of things. There was the famous press conference where John Kerry gave Sergei Lavrov potatoes from Idaho because Lavrov had spoken about his love of potatoes. And so, you know, I would say that the bloom is definitely off the rose of this one-time bromance. They are, you know, it's not been easy for the two of them over these last couple of weeks. And you saw both Kerry and Lavrov looking pretty uncomfortable today. There were some very funny images of the two of them them on this long walk they took, kind of kicking around a soccer ball while they were, it was bizarre. You know, people were tweeting out things like, who moved the goalposts? Or, you know, the ball is in your court. But, you know, I don't think they've been getting along so well lately. And part of that is because, of course, it's Vladimir Putin who's making the decisions. And John Kerry is delivering a message from Obama, but we're not really sure that Sergei Lavrov is able to do much with that message if his boss is saying, this is my position and that's it. So I don't know that their personal relationship is going to have that much of an impact on Putin's decision-making process. It's really much more about what he sees as critical to Russia's national interests.
How real is this, like, this idea now that, you know, Crimea will vote and decide to join Russia, and then he turns to eastern Ukraine and says, if you want in, I'll take you too? Or does he go in and move those troops that are on the border right now?
All of this is possible at this point. I mean, although Lavrov did pledge today, we have no plans to invade eastern Ukraine. As I said, you know, they didn't have plans to invade Crimea either. Right. Yeah. So, you know, all of this is on the table. And that's part of why Russia's neighbors, other former Soviet republics, are watching this so carefully. And they're all very concerned. That's part of why Joe Biden has to go make his vice presidential visit to Poland and Lithuania, who are sitting on tenterhooks, to reassure NATO allies, reassure these former Eastern Bloc countries that the U.S. has their back. The question is, what can the U.S. really do? And that's where the sanctions come in, and that's where we have to see how far are the U.S. and the EU willing to go with those sanctions to really make it hurt, to make Putin pay a price for these actions.
What is sort of the international community? How are they viewing the U.S.? We spoke a little bit about Syria and red lines and the Obama administration's foreign policy. What do you get the sense the U.S. standing is in some of these higher priority conflicts? And are we as weakened as we appear?
We hear again and again from foreign ministers and ambassadors and sort of off-the-record conversations that the U.S. standing is diminished. While we got complaints all over the map when the U.S. was seen as the global policeman interfering in everybody's business under George W. Bush, and nobody liked that, now when the U.S. sets red lines and then doesn't necessarily do what it said it was going to do when those red lines are crossed, that also diminishes our standing. So we saw that with the Syria crisis, which you said, the president threatened to strike if chemical weapons were used, but in fact he didn't go ahead and strike. You know, they worked out a compromise. The Obama administration declared that a victory because they were able to do it without striking. But foreign ministers and countries around the world looked at that and said, wait a second, does that mean the U.S. is not good to its word if they say they're going to defend us? And remember, this raised a lot of questions in Israel. It raised questions in Iran about U.S. promises about Iran never getting a nuclear weapon. So there is something to be said for sticking to your word of what you say you're going to do. And remember, this is a case where President Obama has not said we're going to use military force. Yeah. No one has talked about military force being on the table in reference to Crimea.
Right. So, Ed, speaking of Ukraine and Crimea, there was some talk on Capitol Hill earlier this week about passing an aid package. It got kind of bollocksed up, in part because of internal Republican fighting. And John McCain took some of his colleagues to task, saying, you're no Reagan Republicans, I know Reagan, you guys are weak sauce. What is going on there, and what does it mean, the fact that Congress left for recess without accomplishing something like this?
Well, a few things. Yes, you're right. Ukraine became the latest thing to get mucked up in the internal Republican civil war. McCain, who is a huge advocate for the new Ukrainian government and in fact is spending the evening in Kyiv with about 7 of his Senate colleagues as they visit and meet with political leaders, was apoplectic yesterday, saying that yes, if you may call yourself Republican because that's your registration, but you cannot call yourself a Reagan Republican because Ronald Reagan would have never allowed this to happen. You never would have allowed you guys to basically leave town without providing about $1 billion in loan guarantees, stiff sanctions against Russian officials, and some changes to the IMF that the White House has been asking for since 2010 that would essentially move about $63 billion, I want to say billion, I think it's $1 billion, from a crisis fund into a general fund. And by doing that, you have a little more influence over what the IMF does, and thus the U.S. standing perhaps changes a little bit, and those people who've been telling reporters off the record that they don't like the U.S. might actually have to refrain from saying that type of thing. It will get done when they get back. Congress comes back March 24th. They will pass some kind of a deal. The question is, And the point is that the Republican concerns and broader Democrat versus Republican issues about giving the president something he wants held this up. Important to point out, though, Bob Corker, who's the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, conveyed to reporters that the new Ukrainian prime minister told lawmakers when he visited the Capitol this week, I don't need this money right away. I've actually got to go back to my country, make a bunch of changes in-house in order to be eligible for the IMF aid anyway. But gosh, when I'm ready for that, I'd sure like to have your money. So they have some time.
Okay.
But if we get to the end of March, certainly it would be a real embarrassment.
So here's my question. Does it matter? I mean, does Congress passing a resolution, not passing a resolution, is it going to change anything practically on the ground in Crimea, or is this more an exercise in sort of congressional dysfunction than anything else?
Well, I think it's the latest example to the world that not only is the U.S. not responding to red lines that are crossed, but they can't get their own act together and remind us all of the example it's supposed to be as a democracy. I think that, more than anything, really is what ticked off McCain and others who said, you know, we should be able to do this very quickly and send a message so that Kerry can go to Europe and so that an election can be held in Crimea, while the U.S. has said we will not stand for this.
When this ultimately gets passed, which, as you said, it will, do you think that the IMF quota, the IMF funding issue will be passed along with it? Because, as you know, that would allow loan guarantees not only of $1 billion, but $1.6 billion. But it also would shift voting power a little bit, money as well as voting power within the IMF, which is something the U.S., the Obama administration wants for good reason. Will they get it?
We'll see. And if it doesn't happen this way, it'll happen through the appropriations process or possibly in the next budget. You know, the point is, the argument is, if it had been done, maybe things would be a little different right now. We'll see.
Thanks, everyone. While you're online, stick around to see what else our panelists are reporting on our Essential Reads page. That's at pbs.org/Washington Week. Gwen will be back next week. Thanks for joining us for the Washington Week Webcast Extra. Good night.